The moment Harriet Dawson stepped off the stagecoach into the dust-choked main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, she knew with absolute certainty that she had made either the bravest decision of her life or the most foolish one. And she suspected, with the dry wind whipping red grit into her eyes and the smell of horse dung hanging thick in the afternoon air, that it might well be both at once. She pressed her worn leather traveling bag against her hip and looked up and down the street. Caldwell was a cattle town, one of the last of the real ones, sitting right on the edge of the Cherokee Strip, where the land opened up into something vast and indifferent and beautiful. Frame buildings lined both sides of the street, some with false fronts that stretched up toward the sky, as if pretending to be taller than they were. A saloon called the Blue Ox sat on the corner with its piano, already crying through the open door, even though it was barely past 3 in the afternoon. Horses stood tied to rails, their tails switching at flies. Men in dusty trail clothes moved along the boardwalk with the particular unhurried purpose of men who worked hard and did not see the point in appearing to rush. Harriet was 24 years old, brown-haired, with dark eyes that people who did not know her often mistook for being soft. She had come from St. Louis, where she had spent the past 3 years working in her aunt's millinery shop, stitching hat brims and listening to other women talk about their husbands and their children and their futures. She had grown up in Missouri, but her father had died of fever 2 winters past, and her mother had remarried a man named Gerald who smelled of pipe smoke and disapproval. And after one particularly long Sunday during which Gerald had informed Harriet that a woman of her age really ought to be more agreeable and less opinionated, she had gone home, packed her bag, and written a letter to the name she had clipped from the back page of a newspaper. The advertisement had read, "Wanted capable woman for position of schoolteacher, Caldwell, Kansas territory. Must be of sound character and willing to make permanent residence. Inquire to the office of Mayor R. Aldrich. Salary discussed upon agreement." She had not come as a mail-order bride. She had not come looking for a husband. She had come because she was good at teaching. She had tutored half the children in her neighborhood back in St. Louis. And because she was tired of Gerald's pipe smoke and the endless conversation about hat brims. And because something about the word permanent had looked, in that moment, like the most appealing word she had ever read. Mayor Aldrich turned out to be a short man with an impressive mustache, and the handshake of a man who had been told confidence was expressed through grip. He met her at the stage office and walked her down the boardwalk with the slightly proud gait of a man presenting his town to someone he hoped would be impressed. Harriet was not unimpressed exactly, but she was carefully cataloging details. The 2 men arguing loudly outside the livery stable, the woman in a yellow dress watching from an upper window of the Blue Ox, the general sense that this was a place where things happened whether you wanted them to or not. "You will be teaching at the schoolhouse on Maple Street," Mayor Aldrich told her. 32 children as of last count, ages 6 through 14. The school board meets the first Monday of each month. You will have lodging arranged at the boarding house run by Mrs. Elsa Greer. She is a widow, respectable, and she sets a good table. He paused. "You are younger than I expected." "I am exactly as old as my letter indicated," Harriet said pleasantly. He cleared his throat. "Quite right, quite right." She was settled into Mrs. Greer's boarding house by evening. Her room was small but clean, with a window that looked out over the backyard where a vegetable garden was already showing the first green of spring onions. Mrs. Greer was a stout woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the habit of asking questions, and then answering them herself before you could get a word in, which Harriet found oddly comforting after the long days of travel. "You will want to meet people," Mrs. Greer said at supper, passing Harriet a bowl of beef stew. "There is a church social on Saturday, which is the best way. Reverend Hoskins is long-winded but good-hearted. Oh, and you will want to know about the ranchers because some of them have children in your school, and it helps to know who is who before the school term starts." "Is there anyone I should be particularly aware of?" Harriet asked. Mrs. Greer considered this with the expression of someone sorting through a complex mental ledger. Well, there is the Tanaka family east of town. Mr. Tanaka came over from Japan 20 years ago, married a local woman, has 3 children and one of the finest horse operations in the county. Good people. Then there is the Haskell brothers, who are not so good but are not so bad either. They just drink too much and say too much when they do. There is Doc Brennan, who you will absolutely need to know because children are always getting into things. She paused, then added in a slightly different tone, and there is Milton Wilcox. Something in the way she said the name made Harriet look up from her stew. Who is Milton Wilcox? He runs the Wilcox Ranch out on the South Road, maybe 4 miles. Best cattle operation in this part of Kansas, people say. He has land going back a good distance, and he keeps it well. He has a boy in your school, his nephew, actually, young Thomas, who boards with him because Milton's sister passed on 2 years ago. Mrs. Greer stirred her own stew thoughtfully. Milton is 31, good-looking in that weathered sort of way, well regarded by nearly everyone in Caldwell, honest as the day is long, works himself half to death if you want my opinion. She paused again, in the way of someone deciding how much to say. And, Harriet prompted, and he has not spoken to a woman in any romantic sense since Clara Whitfield left him 3 years ago. Left him at the altar, near enough they were engaged, had been for a year, and then she decided she could not do it, could not stay in Kansas, and she packed up and went back east without more than a note left with the postmaster. Mrs. Greer shook her head. It broke something in that man, I think. He has not been unpleasant about it. He is not the bitter, drinking kind. He is just closed, like a house where all the windows have been shuttered. Harriet listened to this with genuine sympathy, and then filed it away in the part of her mind marked useful social information and went back to her stew, because she had not come to Caldwell to fix broken men. She had come to teach children and find a life of her own, and those things had nothing to do with a rancher with shuttered windows, however good-looking in that weathered sort of way he might be. She was wrong about that, naturally, but she did not know it yet. The school term began on the first Monday of April, and Harriet arrived at the little white schoolhouse on Maple Street 40 minutes early to arrange the desks, and write her name on the blackboard, and give herself a private moment to feel nervous before the children arrived. The schoolhouse was a single room with a potbelly stove in one corner, windows along both sides to let in whatever breeze was going, and 32 desks that were various states of carving and ink staining. She liked it immediately. There was something about the smell of chalk and old wood and young industry that had always made her feel at home. The children came in by 1s and 2s, eyeing her with the frank curiosity of children who have not yet learned to pretend they are not looking. She learned names quickly. It was a talent of hers, and by noon she had all 32 fixed in her memory along with small distinguishing details. Jenny Tanaka, who was 9 and asked 3 questions before Harriet had finished introducing herself. The Hollies twins, who were identical except that one of them sat up straight and the other slouched. And Thomas Wilcox, who was 11, with dark hair and serious eyes and the careful, watchful quality of a child, who had lost someone important and learned to be quiet about it. Thomas Wilcox was not difficult, not troublesome, not anything that required special attention in the way those words usually meant. He was simply the kind of child who did things thoughtfully and did not speak unless he had something to say, and Harriet found herself respecting him in the particular way you respect someone who is young but not stupid. It was a week into the school term that she met Milton. She had kept Thomas after school, not because he was in trouble, but because he had turned in a piece of writing about the history of cattle drives that was genuinely impressive, detailed, well organized, with a sentence at the end that made her want to know who had taught him to think like that. She wanted to tell him so, in the specific way, not just a vague good work, because she believed children deserved to know exactly what they had done well. She was still talking to Thomas on the front steps of the schoolhouse when the horse came up the street, a big bay quarter horse moving at a working trot, carrying a man who sat in the saddle the way some men do when they have ridden every day of their adult lives, which is to say with an ease that looks effortless but is entirely the result of 10,000 hours of practice. "That is my uncle," Thomas said. The man brought the horse to a stop at the schoolhouse fence and swung down, and Harriet had a moment in which several things registered at once. He was tall, broad-shouldered in a canvas work jacket, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving, and the kind of blue eyes that looked permanently a little narrowed against sun. He was also, as Mrs. Greer had said, good-looking in that weathered sort of way, which was, Harriet decided privately, something of an understatement. "Miss Dawson," he said, and touched the brim of his hat, not the full removal, just the touch, the gesture of acknowledgement. His voice was low, with the particular flatness of a man who did not use more words than necessary. "I am Milton Wilcox. I wanted to introduce myself." "Thomas has been telling me about the ranch," Harriet said, which was true. "Please come in, or we can speak here, whichever you prefer." "Here is fine." He came through the gate and stood with his hat in his hands now, turning it by the brim in the absent way of someone who needs something to do with their hands. He looked at Thomas and said, "Go check the horse's near foreleg, will you? She was favoring it a little coming in." Thomas went, and Milton Wilcox looked at Harriet with those sun-narrowed eyes. "I want to say thank you for keeping him," he said. "He told me what you said about his writing. It meant something to him." "It was genuinely good work," Harriet said. "He has a clear way of thinking. You should be proud of him." Something shifted in the man's face, not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one, the muscular preparation that stops just short. "He is a good boy, had some hard years." "I know. I am sorry for the loss of his mother." Milton nodded. A silence sat between them that was not uncomfortable but was careful, the silence of two people who do not yet know each other's rhythms. "If he gives you any trouble—" "He does not," Harriet said. "And if he ever did, I would come to you directly, but he will not." He studied her for a moment as if recalibrating something. Then he did something small but notable. The tension in his shoulders, which she had not consciously clocked until it left, released a fraction of an inch. "All right," he said. "Well, good." He called Thomas back, settled his hat, and touched the brim again in that way of his, and they rode off down the street. Harriet stood on the schoolhouse steps and watched them go and thought, well, Mrs. Greer was not wrong about the weathered part. She thought about him perhaps twice more that week, which she considered entirely reasonable. The church social on Saturday was held behind the white clapboard church at the end of Oak Street, and it was exactly what such things always were. Long tables with food that various women of the community had prepared and were quietly competing over. Men standing in clusters talking about cattle prices and the state of the range. Children running between adults' legs with the inexhaustible energy of creatures who had been sitting still all week. Reverend Hoskins, who was indeed long-winded, introduced Harriet from a wooden platform in a speech that told everyone her name and where she was from 3 times each, which she endured with a smile. She met so many people in the first 2 hours that she had to make mental notes the way she did with her students, little distinguishing markers. Doc Brennan, who had the kind face and tired eyes of a man who had seen too much suffering but refused to be hardened by it. Pearl Sato, wife of Mr. Tanaka, she insisted everyone use her American name, who pressed a jar of pickled vegetables into Harriet's hands and said in clear, precise English that she hoped Harriet would find Caldwell agreeable. The Haskell brothers, who were indeed somewhat loud but not unkind. Mrs. Greer, who circulated like a benevolent satellite, saying things to people and gesturing toward Harriet in a way that suggested she was conducting some kind of social engineering, and was very pleased about it. Milton Wilcox arrived late, coming through the back gate with Thomas at his side and a pie in his hands, peach, someone told Harriet later, from the Danner farm, and the small ripple of acknowledgement that passed through the gathering when he appeared told her something about how he was regarded here. Not famous, not important in the way of mayors and ministers, but simply known, settled, like a fence post that has been in the same place for so long it has grown into the landscape. He did not seek her out. He spoke to men near the fence about cattle things she caught fragments, grass conditions, the railroad, a bull someone was considering buying. Thomas found the other children and was drawn into a game of some kind near the tree line. Harriet ate a plate of food and talked to Pearl Sato and Pearl's oldest daughter Jenny, who was even more full of questions outside of school than in it, and was perfectly happy. It was when she was refilling her cup of lemonade at the long table that Milton appeared beside her, holding out his own cup. "Good turnout," she said, because it was the thing to say and she did not see a reason not to say it. "There is usually a good turnout," he agreed. "People are curious about you, about the new schoolteacher. About you specifically," he said, and something in his tone was not quite flattery, was rather more like straightforward observation, the way you would state that the sky was a particular color. "Thomas talks about you every evening." She smiled at that. "He is a pleasure to teach." "You have been here a week and a half," Milton said, and there was something careful in his voice now, something that she could not quite identify, as if he was navigating something in his own mind while also conducting the conversation. "How are you finding it? Caldwell, I mean. It is different from St. Louis." "It is very different," she said, "but I think I like it." She meant it and meant it specifically about the sense of space, the particular quality of the sky out here, the way you could look in almost any direction and see to the horizon. "Do you think I will stay?" He looked at her with some surprise at the direct question. "I do not know you well enough to have an opinion," he said. "Give me your best guess," she said. He considered. His hat was off because they were at a social and removing it was the done thing. And without it he looked slightly younger, or perhaps just different. The way people look when you see them outside their usual context. "People either take to this place or they do not," he said finally. "I think you are the kind who takes to things when she decides to." It was a perceptive thing to say, and Harriet was both pleased by it and slightly discomfited by the accuracy of it. She covered this by taking a drink of her lemonade. "That is either a compliment or a warning," she said. "Probably both," he said, and there it was, not quite a smile still, but something close, something that did get to his eyes, and she thought, "Oh, there it is. There is the man underneath the shuttered house Mrs. Greer described, just briefly visible in the gap between the boards." Then it was gone, and he was nodding and moving off to speak to someone, and Harriet watched him go with the first genuine stirring of something she was not ready to name. Over the following weeks, the pattern established itself the way patterns do in small places, gradually, and then all at once, until it felt as if it had always been there. Milton came to collect Thomas at the end of the school day twice a week, on the days when he was riding in for supplies or the bank or the feed store. On those days, he would pause at the schoolhouse fence and sometimes exchange a few words with Harriet. These were always short conversations, practical, about Thomas or about Caldwell, or about whatever immediate thing was present the first real heat of May. A rattlesnake that had been spotted near the back of the schoolyard, a book she had requested from Kansas City that had finally arrived. But there was a quality to those brief exchanges that Harriet began to recognize. He was attentive in the way of someone listening carefully. He remembered things she said. She found herself, on the Tuesday before Milton would come on Wednesday, occasionally thinking of something she wanted to tell him. A story about Thomas, an observation about the town. She thought this was perfectly innocent and was not lying to herself about it exactly, but she was perhaps not examining it as carefully as she might have. Thomas was the bridge between them, and neither of them acknowledged this directly. Through Thomas, she learned things about Milton, that he had built the main house on the Wilcox ranch with 2 hired hands when he was 22, and that he still worked it himself rather than standing back and managing. That he had served briefly as a deputy sheriff, before deciding ranching was more suited to his temperament. That he read not just almanacs and livestock reports but actual books, history and some fiction, and he had a shelf of them in the ranch house that Thomas described with the particularity of a child who has spent time reading them himself. In late May, two things happened in fairly quick succession that changed the quality of things between them. The first was the thunderstorm. It came up fast, as Kansas storms do, with the particular Kansas suddenness that seems to make a particular point about the smallness of plans. Harriet had kept the children in school slightly past the usual hour because they were in the middle of a geography lesson that had become genuinely exciting. She had unrolled a map of the Western Territories, and someone had asked about the Pacific Ocean, and the question had opened into a conversation about California and Oregon and the railroad, and the way the world was changing, and she had lost track of time. By the time she dismissed them, the sky to the southwest was a color that anyone who has spent a season in Kansas knows means business. She sent the children home quickly, with instructions to run, and she was shutting and latching the schoolhouse windows when the first drops hit. Within 10 minutes it was a full plains thunderstorm, rain coming in sheets and lightning moving across the sky with the spectacular indifference of electricity finding its own path. She was not frightened of storms, but she was also not stupid about them, so she stayed in the schoolhouse and waited. She had a book, which helped. She also had a tin of tea that she kept for herself in the desk drawer, which she could not brew because the stove was not lit, but which she held as a comfort anyway. She heard the horse at the door 20 minutes in, and then the door opened and Milton Wilcox came in with half the rain in Kansas on his jacket and hat, and she stared at him. "Thomas said you were still here," he said, in a tone that combined relief and exasperation in a way that she found very human. "I was waiting out the storm," she said. "I can see that." He took off his hat and shook water from it. There was a puddle forming at his feet. He looked around the schoolhouse with what seemed like genuine interest, the desks, the map still unrolled on her table, the blackboard with its chalked lines of geography. Then back at her. "You are all right." "I am perfectly all right," she said, which was true, but there was something warm about the fact of him having come, and she was aware of that warmth in a way that was difficult to set aside. "You rode in from the ranch in this." Thomas was worried, he said simply. "You rode 4 miles in a thunderstorm because your 11-year-old nephew was worried about me," she said. He looked at her with those blue eyes and said nothing for a moment. "Then I was also in town," he said, in a tone that suggested this was more plausible than the truth, and she realized he was lying, not skillfully, and also that he knew she knew it, and something in the air between them became charged in a way that had nothing to do with the lightning outside. "Sit down," she said. "You are dripping on my floor." He sat in the large chair she kept behind her desk, and she sat on one of the student desks with her book, and they waited out the storm together in a quiet that felt different from the careful quiet of their fence-post conversations. This was easier. The rain drummed on the roof, and the lightning lit the windows, and neither of them spoke for stretches of time that would have been awkward with most people, but were not awkward with him. She found herself noticing this. When the storm eased to a steady rain, he stood and said he would walk her to Mrs. Greer's, and she accepted, and they walked together through the rain-quieted streets with his big bay horse following behind them. He did not offer his arm because the street was muddy enough that she needed both hands for her skirts, and she did not expect it. But when they arrived at Mrs. Greer's gate, he opened it and held it for her, and she turned to thank him, and they were standing close enough that she could see a single rain drop caught in his eyelashes before it fell. She said good evening. He said good evening. She went inside. She stood in the hallway of Mrs. Greer's boarding house for a full minute doing nothing at all, and then she went upstairs and told herself, very firmly, to stop it. The second thing happened a week later, on a warm Saturday, when she took the school children on a natural history walk along Bluff Creek, which she had been planning since the beginning of the term. It was an organized expedition, perfectly well managed, until young Charlie Danner fell down a 6-foot bank, and twisted his ankle so badly that carrying him back was more than she and the older children could manage effectively. She sent Jenny Tanaka running for help because Jenny was the fastest child she had, and Jenny herself clearly knew it. Milton was the one who came, because the Wilcox Ranch was the closest property to Bluff Creek, and Jenny had cut across the fields. He came with a spare horse and one of his ranch hands, a weathered Mexican man named Cruz who had been with the Wilcox operation for 8 years. And between them, they got Charlie back to town with efficiency and gentleness. What Harriet remembered afterward was not the crisis. The crisis was managed, but rather the moment near the creek when she had been holding Charlie's hand and talking to him steadily, keeping him calm, and she had looked up and found Milton watching her with an expression that lasted only a second before he rearranged it, but that she had caught nonetheless. It was not admiration exactly, or not only that. It was something more complicated, something she could not fully read, something that looked underneath the surface level of it like pain. She did not ask about it. She thought about it for 3 days. She thought about Clara Whitfield, whose name she had heard from Mrs. Greer, the woman who had left him, and she began to understand the thing about the shuttered windows. It was not that Milton Wilcox was cold. She had known cold men, and he was not one of them. It was that he was careful. He was a man who had taken something vulnerable out of himself, had extended it, and had it handed back to him broken. And now he moved through the world with great competence and great warmth toward the people he was responsible for: Thomas, the ranch hands, the community in its larger sense. But he kept a particular door very firmly shut, and she suspected he had made some kind of internal agreement with himself that the door would stay that way. The trouble was, she was beginning to feel things she had not intended to feel, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge it. It was in early June, when the heat had settled properly over the Kansas plains, and the cattle drives were moving through Caldwell in their boisterous, complicated way. She had learned quickly to keep the children inside during trail days, because trail hands after weeks on the road were not the most decorous of citizens, that she found herself at the Wilcox Ranch for the first time. She had been invited officially, properly, by Thomas, who had asked if she would like to see the ranch, and had produced this invitation with the solemnity of a child who has rehearsed it, which suggested to her strongly that Milton had coached him, and then regretted coaching him, and was now probably somewhere on the property questioning his own judgment. She had said yes because she wanted to see it, and because she was past the point of pretending she did not want to. The ranch was 4 miles south, and Cruz drove her out in the ranch wagon on the Saturday afternoon, a perfectly proper arrangement. The land opened up around her as they drove, the town falling behind, the sky enormous overhead. The Wilcox property announced itself with a line of fence posts that seemed to go on forever, and then the house came into view. It was a good house. Not large by Eastern standards, but substantial and well-made, 2 stories, with a wide front porch and a garden that someone, she suspected Mrs. Greer had a hand in this, had established along the south side with kitchen herbs and a few flowers that had no practical purpose at all. The barn was large and in good repair. There were several outbuildings, a bunkhouse, a large corral where 2 men were working a young horse. It was a place that looked like it had been built by someone who meant to stay. Milton met them in the yard with Thomas, and the 4 of them, her, Milton, Thomas, and Cruz, who clearly regarded himself as part of any occasion at the Wilcox Ranch, walked around the property in the particular way of a ranch tour, which involves a great deal of pointing at things and explaining them, and which Harriet found genuinely interesting because she liked understanding how things worked. She asked questions about the cattle, about the grass management, about the well system. Milton answered them in that careful way of his, with the quality of attention of someone slightly surprised to be asked, and then pleased that they were. She could see him relaxing incrementally, degree by careful degree, the way ice melts when you are not watching it directly. Thomas showed her his room in the house, which had one of the books from the shelf. A history of the Roman Empire open face down on the bed, alongside a collection of stones and one very old, very battered playing card for reasons Thomas did not explain and she did not ask about. At supper, she had been invited to supper, also Thomas's doing but now clearly sanctioned cruise, and the two ranch hands named Pete and Dalloway ate at the long kitchen table with them. And the conversation was ordinary and easy in the way of people who eat together regularly and have run out of awkward topics long ago. Harriet talked about the school and about St. Louis, and about the question Jenny Tanaka had asked that week about whether the earth was actually round or just appeared to be, which had led to a 20-minute demonstration involving an apple and a candle. Cruz told a story about a horse he had known in Sonora that could open any gate ever made, which led to Pete telling a worse story about a cow that had somehow gotten into the bunkhouse twice, both times on Sundays, and Dalloway, who was quiet most of the time, said, "I was there for that," and left it at that. Milton laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, not the precursor to it, not the thing that stopped short, but the actual thing, and it was low and genuine and brief, and it did something to her internal architecture that she did not entirely appreciate. After supper, Thomas went to bed with minimal argument, and Cruz and Pete and Dalloway went to the bunkhouse, and Harriet and Milton sat on the front porch in the particular thick, warm dark of a Kansas summer night with the sound of the ranch settling around them, and they talked. Not about anything in particular. About the stars, which were extraordinary out here without the lights of a city. About the school and where she hoped it would be in 5 years. About a book she had read about the Transcontinental Railroad that she thought he might like. About Thomas and his mother. Her name had been Ruth and she had been Milton's younger sister, and the way Milton said her name told Harriet everything about what that loss had been. She did not push. She listened. The night went on and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and at a certain point the conversation quieted and they sat in a silence that she recognized, with a feeling somewhere between comfort and apprehension, as the silence of two people who are at ease with each other. Cruz brought the wagon around at 9 o'clock, which Harriet suspected was by prior arrangement, and she said her good nights and climbed up. Milton stood at the bottom of the porch steps as the wagon pulled away, and she turned once, and he was still standing there, watching the wagon leave, and even in the dark she could see something in his posture that she could not name. She tried to name it the whole drive home. She arrived at Mrs. Greer's without having succeeded. July came, and with it two things: the summer heat that turned Caldwell into a dust-hazed furnace of a place, and a problem. The problem was Carl Haskell. Carl was the younger of the Haskell brothers, 26, not unkind, but possessed of the particular combination of too much time and too little responsibility that occasionally led him to make decisions he would regret in the daylight. He had decided, sometime around the beginning of July, that Harriet Dawson was a very attractive woman and that he should tell her so, and he had been telling her so with increasing frequency and decreasing subtlety for 3 weeks, showing up at the schoolhouse at the end of the day, at Mrs. Greer's on the pretense of having messages for other boarders, at the general store when she was doing her weekly shopping. He was not threatening. He was not aggressive. He was simply persistent in a way that was wearing. She had told him, clearly and without cruelty, that she was not interested in his attentions. He had nodded as if he understood this, and then appeared the next day with essentially the same approach, which suggested that his understanding was somewhat selective. She handled it herself as long as she could, but in the 3rd week of July he appeared at the schoolhouse while she still had children inside, which crossed a line she cared about, and she found herself genuinely irritated. It was Cruz who mentioned it to Milton. She found out later, because Cruz had been in town the day Carl appeared at the school and had seen it and thought Milton should know. She would, at another time, have been mildly annoyed at being the subject of other people's conversations without her knowledge, but what happened next made it difficult to be annoyed. Milton appeared at her door at Mrs. Greer's that evening, standing on the porch with his hat in his hands, and asked if she had a few minutes to speak to him. They sat in the small parlor Mrs. Greer maintained for exactly this kind of occasion, with the door open in accordance with Mrs. Greer's house rules and Mrs. Greer herself making strategic trips past the doorway with laundry. "Cruz told me about Carl Haskell," Milton said without preamble. "I have handled it," she said. "I know you have handled it," he said. "I did not come to handle it for you. I came to ask if you needed anything handled differently." She looked at him. The distinction he had just made was not a small one. "That is a careful way to put it," she said. "You are not someone who needs rescuing," he said. "But Carl Haskell is someone who sometimes needs a different perspective, and you would provide that perspective. Only if you wanted me to," he said. "As a neighbor, as someone who regards you as." He stopped. "As someone who regards you as what?" She did not ask, because the way he stopped mid-sentence told her something important, told her that whatever word was on the other side of that sentence was one he was not ready to say, possibly one he was not ready to think. She felt the thing between them, the specific quality of it, and she felt also the shape of the closed door Mrs. Greer had described, and she understood in that moment that this man was protecting himself in the only way he knew how to after having been hurt badly. "As a friend," she said, supplying the word for him, gently, not unkindly. He took it. "Yes," he said, "as a friend." "Then as a friend," she said, "it would perhaps be useful if you spoke to Carl Haskell. Not about me specifically, just generally, in whatever way you speak to men who need a different perspective." He spoke to Carl Haskell the following morning. She did not know exactly what was said, but Carl Haskell stopped appearing places she was, and when she next encountered him at the general store, he was polite and somewhat chastened and moved to the other end of the counter without being asked. She considered the matter closed. What was not closed was the question she had been sitting with since the evening in Mrs. Greer's parlor. She knew something was wrong before she knew what it was, which is the way intuition tends to work. She knew it from the specific way Milton did not quite look at her sometimes, and from the almost there then retreated quality of the warmth between them, and from small things she noticed without meaning to. The way he always maintained a certain physical distance that was slightly more than the casual distance of acquaintance, the way their conversations, warm as they were, never quite touched the center of certain things. She thought about Clara Whitfield again. She thought about what Mrs. Greer had said. "He has not spoken to a woman in any romantic sense since." And she thought about the expression she had caught on his face at Bluff Creek, the one that had lasted only a second, the one that looked like pain underneath its surface. She was not a woman who believed in circling a thing indefinitely. She was, as Milton himself had observed, the kind who took to things when she decided to. But she was also not a woman who forced conversations on people who were not ready for them, and she could see clearly enough that he was not yet ready. What she could also see, with a clarity that sat in her chest like something warm and inconvenient, was that she was in love with him. She was in love with his seriousness and the rare, brilliant quality of his laugh. She was in love with the way he was with Thomas, patient, steady, present in a way that a man who had simply agreed to take in his dead sister's son did not have to be. She was in love with his hands, which were big and calloused and careful, and with the way he sat in a saddle, and with the fact that he read Roman history and kept the books where an 11-year-old boy could find them. She was in love with his blue eyes and with the 10,000 things he did not say. She was also in love with someone who had made himself a promise about women, and she did not know that yet, not in the specific way, not as an articulated fact. But she was beginning to understand the shape of it. It was August, the thick heat of high Kansas summer, when things came to a head. The school was out for the summer, which meant she had more time and a different rhythm. She had taken on some bookkeeping work for Mayor Aldrich's office, 2 half-days a week, to keep herself occupied and to earn a little extra. She had become genuinely embedded in Caldwell, in the way that you can only do through the accumulated small details of daily life. knowing which step on the church steps was loose, knowing that the general store got its candy shipment on the first Friday of the month, knowing which family needed what, and being part of the web of mutual support that held a small town together. She and Milton had developed a habit, started without either of them formally noting it, of meeting on Saturday afternoons. This happened partly because Thomas was usually with her on Saturdays. She had taken to including him in her afternoons since school let out, taking him to the library that Mayor Aldrich had established in the back room of the town hall, or on walks, or to the creek, and Milton would come in from the ranch to collect him, and at some point collecting Thomas had turned into staying for a while. On one particular Saturday in August, Thomas had been claimed by the Tanaka children for some adventure that Cruz had agreed to supervise, and Harriet and Milton found themselves together without Thomas as the reason, which had not happened before in quite this unstructured way. They went to the creek, as it happened, because it was too hot to be anywhere else, and the creek had shade and moving water. They sat on the bank under a cottonwood, and she had brought a book, and he had brought absolutely nothing except himself, which she found characteristic. They talked for an hour in the comfortable way. And then she said something that was not part of any plan but simply came out of her, the way true things sometimes do when the temperature and the quiet and the particular quality of the afternoon conspire to make you honest. "I like being with you," she said, not looking at him when she said it, looking at the creek instead. A silence, long enough that she turned to look at him and found him looking at her with an expression that was the most unguarded she had ever seen on his face, wanting and afraid. "Harriet," he said, and then he stopped. "You do not have to say anything," she said quickly, because she could see what this was costing him and she did not want to make it worse. "I need to," he said. He took off his hat, set it down on the grass, pressed one hand against the back of his neck in the way of someone physically trying to dislodge something. "I made a decision," after he stopped again. "There was a woman, Clara. We were going to be married and she left, and I decided after that that he exhaled, that I was not going to do that again, that I was done with the whole, a gesture with his hand, wide and slightly helpless. I decided it." She absorbed this. "When did you decide it?" "3 years ago. "And have you reconsidered since?" "No," he said then, not until he stopped. She waited. The creek moved past them with its small, indifferent sound, and the cottonwood leaves turned in the light, hot breeze, and somewhere on the other bank a meadowlark was singing its emphatic, repeating song. She waited because she understood that he needed the space to find his way to the end of the sentence. "Not until you got off the stagecoach," he said, "and I did not even know who you were yet." She stared at him. "You saw me get off the stagecoach." "I was at the stage office," he said. "I was picking up a shipment." He was looking at her now with those direct blue eyes, and she thought she had never seen anyone look both so brave and so terrified simultaneously. "You had that bag, the worn brown one, and you were looking up and down the street, and you looked not afraid. You looked like someone taking the measure of something, like you were deciding whether it was good enough." A pause. "I have thought about that look a good many times since." Harriet felt something break open inside her in the most gentle possible way, like something sealed that had been waiting to be unsealed. She had 1,000 things she could say. She chose the most honest one. "Milton," she said. "Clara Whitfield left and that hurt you, and I am genuinely sorry for that. She should not have done it the way she did. But she is not here and I am not going back to St. Louis, not for Gerald and his pipe smoke and not for anything else, because I took the measure of this place the day I arrived and I decided it was good enough. I decided you were good enough. I have not been hiding that very well." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "I have been afraid." "I know," she said. "I could see it." "Not of you," he said. "Of being wrong again, of," he shook his head, "of what it costs when it goes wrong." "That is a reasonable thing to be afraid of," she said. "I'm also a little afraid of it. But I would rather be a little afraid and try than spend the next 30 years wondering what would have happened if I had not told you the truth." He was quiet. She watched his face, the working of it, the decision happening in real time behind those careful eyes. "I should have said something sooner," he said. I kept trying to find the words and then putting it away. You found them now, she said. I should have found them sooner, he said. You deserve to know what you were, he stopped. What you might be walking into. I walked into it with my eyes open, she said. I tend to. Something that had been held very tightly in him for a very long time released. She could see it happen. The shutters opened. He reached across the grass between them and took her hand, and he held it in that way of his carefully, as if it was something that mattered and he wanted to be sure it was not damaged, and said nothing. And she said nothing, and the creek moved past them and the meadowlark sang and the cottonwood leaves turned in the light. They sat like that for a long time. The walk back to town was different. Everything was different in the specific way that things are different after the ground has shifted. Not dramatically changed in appearance, but fundamentally altered underneath. He kept her hand when they left the creek bank, until the path narrowed and they had to walk single file, and then took it again when it widened. They talked and did not talk in equal measure. She told him about the moment on the stagecoach when she had thought brave or foolish. He told her about the morning he had found Thomas sitting on the porch of Ruth's house after the funeral, waiting for someone to tell him what was going to happen next, and the specific way that had settled something in Milton permanently, the knowledge that he was responsible for something irreplaceable. She understood, hearing this, how connected those two things were, his capacity for love, which was immense and serious, and his terror of what it cost to love. She understood it and she held it carefully. He walked her to Mrs. Greer's gate, and she was aware of Mrs. Greer's presence somewhere behind a window, and she did not care. She turned to say good evening, and he was standing close enough that she could see every detail of his face clearly, the sunburned skin and the few lines at the corners of those blue eyes, and the jaw that still needed shaving always, because he was that kind of man. Come to supper tomorrow, he said. You and not Thomas, because Thomas will be at the Tanaka farm for the Sunday. All right, she said. I would like to begin again, he said, properly, without the shutters, as Mrs. Greer would say. She stared at him. She said shuttered windows about you, and you know it. Mrs. Greer has been telling me I need to do something about myself for 2.5 years, he said, with a dryness that she found extremely endearing. I have had considerable warning. She laughed properly, and his face did the thing she loved, the smile that finally got all the way to his eyes, and she said good evening and went inside. The supper was not the only supper. There were many more after it, some at the ranch and some at Mrs. Greer's, which Mrs. Greer facilitated with barely concealed delight, and some at the hotel dining room when he came into town, and she was not free until late. The quality of what had been between them, always warm, always attended, always carrying that current of something unspoken, was now warm and attended and spoke itself freely, and it turned out that there was a great deal to say. He told her about Clara, the whole of it, not just the leaving but the before. They had grown up in different parts of Kansas and met at a cattle show when he was 27. She had been charming and lovely and full of energy, and had found the ranch romantic, or had believed she could find it romantic, and it had taken living with the reality of it for nearly a year before she understood that the romance and the reality were not the same thing, and by then they were engaged and she was unhappy and she had done the thing she did. He was not bitter in the telling of it. He was, she thought, something more complicated than bitter. He was someone who had made his peace with the fact of it, but not yet with the fear it had left behind. Do you understand now why I could not say it? He asked. Why I could not find the words for so long? I kept thinking that you would decide the same thing, that I was too much of what I am, too settled in this place, too little of what is elsewhere. Milton, she said, I left elsewhere deliberately. I chose here. She paused. I chose here because of the sky and the school and the space. And then separately and additionally, I chose you. Those are two different choices and both of them are permanent. He absorbed this with the focused seriousness he gave to everything that mattered. Then you are extraordinary, he said, without decoration. She had been called beautiful, which was a thing people said. She had been called clever, which was a thing teachers were sometimes said as a way of diminishing them. She had never been called extraordinary by someone who meant it the way he meant it, the way a man means something when he has been silent about it for months and has finally found the words. "I know," she said, and made him laugh. He courted her the way a serious man courts, with intention and consistency and small, thoughtful gestures that were nothing to do with display and everything to do with attention. He brought her books from his shelf that he thought she would like, with small notes tucked inside about specific passages. He learned which of the Caldwell businesses treated her with the full respect due to her as the town's schoolteacher and spoke, quietly but clearly, when that respect was less than it should be. He came to every one of her school events without needing to be asked: the fall exhibition where the children presented their summer learning projects, the spelling contest in October, the harvest festival. There were also small injustices of the time that they navigated together. A member of the school board had objected to Harriet teaching the Tanaka children alongside the others, phrasing it in the polite language of tradition, and Milton had attended that school board meeting and said, in his quiet, flat, entirely unmovable way, that tradition was a fine thing when it was worth keeping, and that this particular tradition was not, and he had said it with such uncomplicated certainty that the school board member had withdrawn the objection. Pearl Sato had heard about it and had sent Milton a jar of pickled plums, which he had shared with everyone at the ranch. September turned to October and October to November, and Harriet found that she had been right about one thing: she was permanent here. The school had 35 students now, 3 more arrived since she started. She had petitioned the school board for a new reader for the upper students and won. She knew every family in Caldwell and was known in turn, not as the new schoolteacher anymore, but simply as Miss Dawson, as a fixed point of the town's landscape. And she was in love in the way that grows and does not simplify, that takes on more detail and more dimension the more time you spend looking at it. She loved how he was with the horses, specifically with the young ones, patient in a way that was different from his other patients, quieter, more physical, a communication that had nothing to do with words. She loved how he argued directly, without cruelty, and always with a willingness to be wrong if someone made a good enough case. She loved that he had kept Ruth's Bible on his bedside table, and that he could not talk about Ruth without the careful stillness that was his equivalent of grief. He told her he loved her on a November evening, standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse, while the first real cold of the year moved across the plains. She had been staying late to mark papers, and he had come by, as he sometimes did now, without needing a reason. She was at her desk with the lamplight on the papers, and he was leaning in the doorway watching her, and when she looked up he said it, simply, no preparation, the way he said things when he meant them most. She set down her pen and looked at him. "I love you too," she said. "I have for quite some time. You took a while to get there." "I know," he said. "I am sorry for the while." "You got there," she said. "That is what counts." He crossed the room and she stood, and he took her face in his hands, those careful big calloused hands, and kissed her for the first time. And it was what kissing him had always been going to be: deliberate and tender and worth every day of the while. He asked her to marry him in December, on a clear cold day at the ranch when the winter sky was that extraordinary blue that happens only in winter, high and pale at the edges and deep overhead, and the ground was frost-white, and the breath of the horses made clouds in the cold air. He had Thomas with him because he had told Thomas first. She found this out later, and Thomas had apparently said, in the manner of an 11-year-old who has already reached a conclusion the adults were slow to, "Yes, obviously, you should do that." He did not get on one knee in the mud, which she was grateful for, because that would have been unlike him. He stood in front of her in the yard and said, "I would very much like you to marry me. I want you to know that I have thought about this with full seriousness, and I am not afraid anymore. Or I am a little afraid, but it is the good kind." "The good kind," she said. "The kind that means you care about whether something works," he said. "Not the kind that makes you shut everything out." She pulled him down to her by the lapels of his jacket and kissed him in the cold air and said yes. And Thomas, who was watching from the porch, made a noise that managed to convey simultaneously that he was embarrassed and extremely pleased. And Cruz, who was visible in the distance near the barn, raised a hand in acknowledgement of something he had apparently seen coming for quite some time. They were married in April, the following spring, which was almost exactly 1 year after Harriet had stepped off the stagecoach into Caldwell's dust-blown Main Street. The wedding was at the church on Oak Street, with Reverend Hoskins presiding and keeping himself to a mercifully condensed version of his usual expansiveness, helped along by Mrs. Greer, who had apparently given him a strong word in advance. Mayor Aldrich was there. Doc Brennan was there. Pearl Sato and the Tanaka family were there. Cruz and Pete and Dalloway were there in their best clothes, which in Cruz's case involved a silver-buckled belt that he clearly kept for specific occasions. Carl Haskell was there and behaved perfectly, because he was not a bad man, only a young one who had needed a different perspective. Thomas stood up beside Milton as the closest thing to a best man the occasion had, at Thomas's own request, expressed with characteristic directness. "I want to stand up with you," he had told Milton. "I think I should." Milton had looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Yes, you should." Harriet wore a dress she had made herself, pale blue, with her mother's ivory brooch at the collar. She had written to her mother and not to Gerald, and her mother had sent the brooch with a letter that was careful and warm and said, between its lines, that she was proud. The dress was simple and the brooch was beautiful, and she walked down the aisle with Mayor Aldrich offering his arm in the absence of her father. And when she arrived at the front of the church, Milton looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was uncomplicated joy, and it was the best thing she had ever seen. He said his vows in that low, flat voice of his, and they meant everything they were supposed to mean, and she said hers back to him, and they were pronounced man and wife, and the church made all the sounds churches make in these moments. And then he kissed her, and it was every bit as good as the first one, and Thomas on his left made the noise again, the embarrassed, pleased one, and there was laughter, and it was perfect. The celebration after was at the Tanaka property, which was large enough to hold everyone, and Pearl Sato had organized the food in a way that combined her own traditions with the community's, which meant there were things on the table that no one could entirely identify, but everyone ate with enthusiasm. Cruz played the guitar, which it turned out he did exceptionally well, and there was dancing on the flattened grass until the stars were well up. Milton danced with her in the way of a man who is not naturally a dancer, but who will learn something if it matters enough to him, which is to say not entirely gracefully but with complete commitment. And she danced with him and laughed at him, and he laughed at himself. And at a certain point in the evening, when the music had gone slower and the crowd had thinned and they were just moving in a loose circle in the night air, he said into her hair, "I almost lost this. I almost made myself stay closed." "But you did not," she said, "because you were very stubborn about it," he said. "I prefer to call it patient," she said. "You were also very stubborn," he said, and she felt him smile against her hair. They moved into the ranch house, which they rearranged together in ways that were practical and in ways that were entirely not practical, but were about making it theirs. She brought her books, which joined his on the shelf in a combination that Thomas immediately began working through systematically. She put some of her mother's things in the kitchen. She planted more flowers along the south side, which meant the existing ones now had company. The first winter of their marriage was hard in the way Kansas winters are hard, with cold that meant something and snow that stayed, and the particular work of keeping a ranch running through conditions that did not care about your plans. She learned things she had not known about herself, that she was better in cold weather than she had thought, that she had an instinct for which animals needed attention in a way she had not had time to discover before, that she and Milton made decisions together in a working rhythm that was one of the most satisfying things she had ever experienced, practical, honest, equal. She also learned, with some anguish on his behalf and her own, that Thomas was going to age out of her school and eventually out of the ranch and into his own life, and that this was the right thing even though it made both of them feel something complex and real. Thomas was 12 now, then 13, growing with the focused intention of a plant finding the light, becoming more clearly himself every season, methodical, thoughtful, possessed of an unexpected dry humor that was entirely his own. He was going to be all right, and knowing this was worth the ache of knowing he was growing up. In the second year of their marriage, Harriet learned she was expecting, and she sat with this knowledge for 2 whole days before she told Milton, because she wanted to be absolutely sure it was true, and because she wanted to tell him properly, in a way that the moment deserved. She told him at the kitchen table in the morning over coffee, because that was where they had their best conversations. The particular quality of the early morning light and the first coffee and the day not yet begun gave things said there a particular weight. She told him simply, without drama, and watched his face. He sat very still for a moment. Then he put down his coffee cup and reached across the table and took both her hands and said, "Are you well? Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. "I am very all right." The joy that moved across his face was the same uncomplicated kind from the wedding, and she understood that this was what he looked like when he allowed himself to feel something fully, wide open, briefly, before the careful man reassembled himself around it, but in there, fully present, unmistakable. Thomas, told that evening, said, "I knew it," in the manner of someone who has been tracking evidence. When pressed on what he knew and from what evidence, he simply said, "You have been different lately. Both of you." This was such a complete and unanswerable statement that neither Milton nor Harriet attempted to answer it. The pregnancy was healthy, if occasionally eventful in the way all pregnancies are. Doc Brennan visited with comfortable regularity and pronounced everything proceeding well. Pearl Sato arrived one afternoon with a collection of knowledge about what helped and what didn't, that was more immediately useful than anything the medical textbooks covered. Mrs. Greer, who Harriet suspected would have been there every day if social convention had permitted it, came twice a week and was genuinely invaluable. Milton managed his anxiety by being extremely useful, which she found both touching and occasionally excessive. She had to talk to him once, in the direct way they both preferred, about the difference between attentive and hovering, and he listened and adjusted with the good grace that was one of the things she loved most in him. In the autumn of their second year of marriage, in September, their son was born. She named him James for her father, and Milton held him in the lamplight of the bedroom with Thomas standing at the doorway looking in, and the expression on Milton's face was the fullest thing she had ever seen on a human being: wonder and love, and the particular kind of terrified joy that is specific to the moment you understand that you love something this much, and there is nothing you can do about it except go on loving it. "He looks like you," Thomas said from the doorway. "He looks like both of us," Harriet said. "He has your uncle's chin, though." Milton looked up from the baby to her with eyes that were not entirely dry, which she found neither surprising nor anything other than exactly right. He said nothing. He did not need to. Everything was in the room. James Wilcox grew up with the particular energy of a boy raised between a schoolteacher and a rancher, which meant he was both extremely well-read for his age and completely at ease with horses before he was 5. He called Thomas Tom, with the casual familiarity of a much younger sibling, and Thomas, who by the time James was born was nearly 15 and beginning to develop the serious, competent quality of a young man, rather than a boy, bore this with a fondness he pretended not to feel and everyone could see. The ranch in those years was a good place, which is to say it was a place where work was done and people were cared for and the days had meaning. Milton's operation had grown, not dramatically, not in the way of men who were trying to prove something, but steadily, in the way of a man who was good at what he did and paid attention. Cruz was still there, gray coming into his hair now, but the same. his horses still capable of opening things they should not have been opening. Pete and Dalloway had moved on and been replaced by others, the ordinary cycling of working ranch hands. Harriet's school had grown too. The school board, with some persistence on her part, had agreed to a second classroom and the possibility of a second teacher, and she had written letters to Kansas City and had been corresponding with a woman named Agnes Marsh, who was finishing her normal school training and was considering the West, and who sounded, from her letters, like exactly the kind of person who would take to things when she decided to. There were years in there she would not have wanted to skip them, which is what made them good, that were unremarkable in the large sense but full in the small one. The summer when Thomas turned 16 and Milton gave him real responsibility on the ranch, and you could see Thomas becoming something in real time. The winter when James was 2 and they were snowed in for 5 days, and she and Milton read aloud to each other at the kitchen table, while the storm roared outside and James slept and was warm and the house held. The spring when the creek flooded badly and half the town's lower properties were damaged, and the whole community worked together to repair and recover. And she felt, in a way she had never felt anything before, that she was part of something. She and Pearl Sato had become genuine friends, the kind of friends who say the true thing rather than the polite thing, which in a small town in Kansas in 1880 was not always easy for a Japanese-American woman, and Harriet knew this and thought about it and tried to do what she could, which was not always enough but was always honest. Pearl had once told her, in that direct way of hers, "You are one of the people who sees me. Not everyone does." Harriet had not known what to say to that exactly, so she had said, "I see you because you are worth seeing," and Pearl had nodded once, a single firm nod, and that was that. The question of Thomas and his future resolved itself the way Thomas resolved everything, quietly and thoroughly, and with a plan already in place by the time anyone else realized there was a decision to be made. He had decided at 17 that he wanted to study law. He had been reading Milton's history books for years, yes, but he had also been reading whatever legal documents he could get his hands on, asking Doc Brennan and Mayor Aldrich questions about governance and property rights and the structures that held or failed to hold a community together. And at 17, he told Milton and Harriet over supper that he wanted to go to Kansas City and study. Milton sat with this for 2 days, which was his version of a quick response. Then he sat down with Thomas and asked him exactly what he had in mind, in the practical, detail-oriented way he asked about everything. And Thomas had a specific, organized answer to every question because he was Thomas, and at the end of it Milton said, "All right," and then turned to Harriet and she said, "We will work out the money," because they would. Thomas left for Kansas City in the spring of the year James turned 3, and Harriet stood at the gate of the ranch and watched him ride away down the South Road with a bag of books and a reserve of quiet determination that was entirely his own, and she felt something that was grief and pride braided together so tightly she could not have separated them. Milton's hand was at her back. She leaned into him. "He will be extraordinary," she said. "He already is," Milton said. James, standing between them and not entirely following what was happening but understanding it was important, said, "Is Tom coming back?" "Yes," Milton said. "Tom is coming back." "Good," James said, and went back to whatever he had been doing, which was the excellent, uncomplicated faith of 3-year-olds, and something Harriet tucked away in her memory to return to. By the time James was 4, Harriet was expecting again, and this time she told Milton over breakfast as she had before in the morning light with coffee, because it was still the best time for things that mattered. He reacted in the same way, the stillness, the hands, the question about whether she was well, and then the joy, uncomplicated, whole. Their second child was a daughter born in October, and they named her Ruth, for Milton's sister, and he wept without any attempt to conceal it when he held her for the first time, which was the right thing. And she wept a little too, from tiredness and joy and the particular fullness of the moment. And James, who was now 4 1/2 and had opinions about everything, looked at the baby, and announced that her name should be Bessie, which Harriet filed away as evidence that James was going to be a force of nature. Ruth Wilcox, from the first, had a quality that Harriet recognized as distinctly Milton's: watchful, quiet, taking things in before making any pronouncements. At 6 months she was already studying her hands with the focused consideration of a scientist, and Milton, watching her, smiled the smile that went all the way to his eyes. "She is thinking about something," he said. "She thinks about everything," Harriet said. "She is exactly like you." "Lord help her," he said. "Lord help everyone," she said fondly. The years settled in a way that felt, from the inside, like exactly what a life was supposed to feel like. Not without difficulty, not without loss, not without the ordinary weight of time and work and the constant negotiation of being human, but full. Genuinely full, in the sense that when she lay in bed at night with Milton's arm around her, and the ranch quiet outside and the children sleeping, there was no part of her that felt unfilled, no corner of her that was waiting for the real thing to begin. Thomas came home from Kansas City in the summer James turned 6, having passed his examinations and obtained his qualification to practice law in the state of Kansas, which he announced at supper with exactly the understated delivery of someone who has worked very hard for something and is going to let the facts do the talking. Milton looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Your mother would have been proud of you." And Thomas, for just one moment, was not understated at all. He set up his practice in Caldwell, in rooms above the general store, and he was excellent at it in the way that people are excellent at things they are suited for at the deepest level. He took cases for people who could not afford to pay what he could have charged, and he was rigorously fair. And within a year and a half, he had the kind of reputation that is built entirely on demonstrated quality rather than self-promotion. He also, in the second year back in Caldwell, met Agnes Marsh. Agnes had come to Caldwell 2 years earlier as the second teacher Harriet had arranged, and she was exactly as her letters had suggested: direct, practical, warm, and fully capable of taking to things when she decided to. She and Harriet had been colleagues and genuine friends, and when Thomas walked into the school one afternoon to speak to Harriet about a legal question regarding the school board and found Agnes there instead, Harriet, who had not planned this, watched the encounter from the window of the back classroom and thought, with great satisfaction, that some things arrange themselves. Thomas was 20 by then, Agnes was 22. And the thing that happened between them happened with the particular velocity of two people who are both entirely capable of making up their minds quickly when presented with sufficient evidence. By Christmas, Harriet was fairly sure about it. By spring, it was clear to everyone. Thomas, in his characteristic way, spoke to Milton about it before doing anything else, which Milton reported to Harriet that evening at the kitchen table with an expression of profound, bemused affection. "He presented it very systematically," Milton said. "He had reasons in order." "What did you tell him?" Harriet asked. "I told him he was 20 years old and more than capable of making his own decisions," Milton said, "and that Agnes was a fine person, and if he was serious about her he should tell her so." He paused. "He said he would be systematic about that too." "Was he?" Harriet asked. "I have no idea," Milton said. "She appears to have said yes, so presumably it went reasonably well." Agnes, who told Harriet about it with the directness of a close friend, said that Thomas had come to the schoolhouse after the students left and told her, in a measured and serious way, that he had given the matter considerable thought, and he believed his feelings to be genuine and lasting, and had asked whether she felt anything of a similar nature. Agnes had told him that she did. He had kissed her once formally, and said he would call on her with her permission, and she had told him he had her permission, and then he had left, and she had stood in the empty schoolhouse for 3 full minutes before sitting down. "He is a very unusual young man," Agnes told Harriet. "He is," Harriet agreed. "He always has been. They were engaged by summer and married the following year in the same church on Oak Street where Harriet and Milton had been married, with the same Reverend Hoskins presiding, slightly older and marginally less long-winded. Cruz played guitar again. Mrs. Greer cried openly and without apology. James, who was 8, was deeply disinterested in the ceremony and extremely interested in the food after it. And Ruth, who was 4, wore a white dress and spent most of the celebration trying to get the horses in the churchyard to eat grass from her hand. Thomas at his wedding had his uncle's bearing, the stillness, the directness, the economy of movement, and also something of his mother in the dark eyes. He looked at Agnes when she came down the aisle with an expression that Harriet recognized, because she had seen it before in a different church on a different man she loved. Milton, sitting beside her in the pew, felt her looking at him and turned, and their eyes met, and she thought, "This is what we built." This is what came from that year, from the stagecoach and the schoolhouse and the creek and the shuttered windows that opened. Thomas walking into a life of his own. 2 children who did not know yet what they were capable of but would. This town that had become permanent in the best sense. This man beside her who had been afraid and had been honest about being afraid and had chosen her anyway. He took her hand in the pew and held it, which was what he did, and she held it back. After the wedding, when the celebration had wound down and Thomas and Agnes had left for their own house. Thomas had bought a small house on Elm Street, which he had negotiated with the precision you would expect. And James and Ruth were asleep in the wagon under Cruz's supervision. Harriet and Milton sat alone at one of the long tables in the Tanaka yard, in the dark after the lanterns had burned low, with the kind of quiet that belongs to the end of days that have been full and good. "Do you ever think about her?" Harriet asked. She did not need to specify. "Sometimes," he said, "not in the way I used to. When she left, I thought it was about me, that I was too much of this place, too fixed, too—" he stopped, the old habit then found the word. "Too rooted. I thought I was not enough of what people go looking for. And now," she said, "now I think she knew herself well enough to know what she needed," he said. "And she was right that it was not this. And I hope she found it somewhere." He paused. "And I think if she had not left, I would not have been ready when you got off the stagecoach. I would have been someone else, less—" he stopped again. "Less open," she said, "less grateful," he said, "for what it costs and what it gives back." She leaned her head on his shoulder and he shifted to accommodate her, the easy accommodation of 2 people who have been fitting together for years. "I came here looking for permanent," she said. "I did not know it would look like this." "Is it what you wanted?" he asked, and there was still, after everything, a small thread of genuine asking in the question, not insecurity exactly, but the care of a man who did not take things for granted. "It is more than what I wanted," she said. "Because I did not know to want it." The sky over Caldwell was the same sky it had always been, enormous and permanent in its own right, turning slowly with the stars that Cruz had pointed out to James last summer. The ones that had always been there, the ones the Comanche navigated by, the ones that Milton's father had taught him before the land was even this settled, and that Harriet was now teaching to her children, adding them to the long inheritance of what you pass on. James would be 9 in the autumn. Ruth would start school in 2 years. Thomas and Agnes were beginning something that would have its own complications and its own joys, and Harriet was fairly sure, from the particular way Agnes had been looking lately, that there would be news of another kind before the year was out. The ranch was doing well. The school would have 38 students in the fall term. Doc Brennan said everyone was in good health. The cottonwood by Bluff Creek where she and Milton had sat on that August day was still there and still had the meadowlark. She had come here at 24 with a worn leather bag and a permanent in a newspaper advertisement, and a set of the jaw that her mother called stubborn, and she called knowing her own mind. She was 30 now, and it had been enough. More than enough. Everything. Milton turned his head to press a kiss to her hair, a habitual, effortless thing, the gesture of a man who had stopped being afraid and discovered that what was on the other side of the fear was exactly this. 2 children sleeping in a wagon, a nephew starting his own life, a town that was home in the complete sense, and a woman who had stepped off a stagecoach and taken the measure of everything and decided it was good enough. He had sworn off women, once, in a man's private self-protective way, in the aftermath of pain, and the reasonable calculation that some things were not worth the cost. He had held to that for 3 years with the stubbornness that was also, in its own way, self-knowledge. And then a woman had arrived who did not know about the swearing off, and he had not found the words to say it, not right away, not until the August afternoon at the creek when she had said "I like being with you" and looked at him with those dark eyes that were not soft at all, that were the most clear and certain eyes he had ever looked into. He had found the words, eventually. He had always been better at the words when they mattered enough. The night sat around them, warm and full of the sounds of Kansas in summer, the insects and the distant cattle and the piano and the blue ox that could be heard even this far from town, carrying on its one-note conversation with the dark. Harriet and Milton sat in the remains of the day with their hands laced together, and there was nothing unresolved, nothing left hanging, nothing that required anything more than the living of it. This was the permanent she had chosen. This was the permanent that had chosen her back. Cruz walking past with James in his arms, the boy had woken and wandered and been collected before he could get into anything, gave them the look of a man who has seen everything and is satisfied with how it turned out and kept walking. James, half asleep on Cruz's shoulder, said without opening his eyes, "Are we going home?" "Yes," Cruz told him. "Good," said James, and slept. They went home.